Magic. In order to ask the question of this first lecture, I believe that a preliminary question must be asked. Where are we? And the answer that is familiar and will become unfamiliar and I hope alive this evening is found in the land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam. Universities are an infrequent topic for academic discussion. I will have more to say near the end of this first lecture about the plan of these 3 lectures, but I will bring to bear my expertise in philosophical reflection to consider topics that are usually approached in a more practical and immediate manner. It is a great honor to be opening this new series of J.V. Clyne lectures at Green College. And I thank my hosts and especially the Principal Mark Vesey for making me welcome here. Our public institutions require engaged thinking in this 21st century. You will see, I hope, the power of ideas to help us think about universities. And I will defend the openness of questions throughout, and so hope that together we can develop these questions further. So to the first, but now it's the second question. For the first was, where are we? Where are the students? UBC on the Vancouver campus has approximately 56,000 students. One might well assume that the students are on campus, studying. We speak about attending university, and the current agenda at UBC includes completing 12,000 residence places, and with plans to grow this dramatically over the next 5 years. I think some of these people are responsible for that. While UBC claims bragging rights to most student residence places, it is not dramatically different from several other major Canadian universities. For instance, the University of Toronto with almost 9,000. But I think the key issue is to recognize how very small the number is in relation to the total number of students. If one compared this to an Ivy League school, you would find numbers much closer to 100% in residence. Even some of the big public universities in the US have higher rates of dorms than we do. So where do the students live? Recent survey data indicates that while almost half of the first-year undergraduates do live on the campus, the number shrinks to 10% in the 4th year. Perhaps the key indicator of where they are is the commuting times. Again, on average, traveling to and fro the campus, and 25% of the students are spending jumped ahead. For the 4th year students, you can read it for yourself, they spend 6.3 hours per week traveling. And 25% of the students are spending 11 hours or more per week. Here too I have heard UBC has bragging rights, the longest average commute for students. But these are again not hugely divergent from other major Canadian universities. If I had a map of where the students are living, we would see them spread near and far in the Lower Mainland. And while I don't have the access to the data yet, I believe that you would find that many are living at home with their families, including parents and sometimes extended family members. So it seems much of the time the students are on the bus. I want to think about that with you, and here are two key features. First, the UPass BC, and second, the potential SkyTrain expansion. Again, I'm a stranger here, but the PASS program seems a remarkable intervention in the challenge of commuting as well as facilitating travel throughout the transit system's landscape. I can relate that the U of Toronto has nothing like this. As for the extension of the SkyTrain or subway, well, it would dramatically decrease commuting time and also make a much closer connection to the city and other regional municipalities. York University in Toronto has finally been connected to the subway system, and changes are just beginning. Of course, the implications of these distances and travel times are multiple. Again, according to the undergraduate survey data, the NESI data, 70% of students participate in less than 5 hours per week of co-curricular activities, including sports, organizations, publications, etc. There is obviously a limitation on how engaged in the university-sponsored student experience our students are. Frankly, this is consistent, again, in most large public universities. There are obviously challenges if we imagine that universities are supposed to provide a place where students live and play, where the social life outside the classroom will be curated for them. It is an image that serves only a few Canadian universities, but is dominant in relation to the US and the English university systems. There are several complex issues here, but clearly one approach would be to focus on the most important feature of Vancouver life, real estate. I'll have more to say about land and endowments in a few moments, but it does not take a subtle mind to realize that the costs of residing in this region have gone beyond the reasonable expectation of almost all students. And indeed, access for middle and lower income students points to a vital need for affordable residences somewhere. The rental market is impossible, the housing market the same. Vancouver is special. But it is also true that in the Greater Toronto area there are huge pressures to find places to live. Living at home with your parents becomes almost inevitable. A second economic approach would be to point to the increase in international students, whose fees are anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000 more per student than the domestic students. These students do need a place to live away from their family homes. There is pressure for the universities to build residences that will house these students who are more likely to want a room on campus. The economic pressure is complicated in terms of politics, both international, think Saudi Arabia, and provincially, British Columbia's University for whom? And also in terms of social issues, as the strong claims for an international economic order as well as global competition on various planes, etc., etc. Were I an expert in the field of international higher education, I might be able to offer some insight into the forces driving this increase of international students, and that might go some way to explaining, or exploring at least, why the university needs to house more students on campus. But if I might take a few steps away from these hot topics, I would like to reflect briefly on the land on which the University of British Columbia stands. I regularly teach comparable matters at the University of Toronto, which began in a rich and important battle over land endowments and religious authority in the university. The UBC story, probably too often told, is interesting because it seems that only in 1922, when 1,200 students staged a dramatic march from the shacks near the Vancouver General Hospital to the largely unbuilt campus in Point Grey, did the province finally provide sufficient funding to build the campus. What was a pilgrimage became the Great Trek in memory and in stone, and this points to one key element of UBC. The students were a significant actor in the creation of the university. They marched in order to get a campus built, not for dormitories, but for classrooms, laboratories, libraries. Their leadership came after literally decades of start and stop, mostly stop, action by the province. The students wanted to study here, and the funding for the institution came from the province and from its establishment of land endowments. The earlier endowments in the interior, near Williams Lake, didn't raise much income. So a second tranche was given, the university endowment lands right next to the campus. That is, the income from the land was supposed to fund the university. This is a long-standing practice in higher education, running through U.S. land-grant universities to European medieval colleges and universities, and including Islamic madrasas and Waqf bestowals. Endowments are land held in trust, not simply property that can be sold. And to be in trust is to articulate a relation to the land that could be parsed not merely in husbanding the resource for higher returns, but also as a kind of guardianship. One of the challenging features for many of our universities is that the value of their real estate has escalated dramatically. It is now a resource that is almost too valuable not to put to use, or in some cases overdevelop. This is especially acute in Point Grey. But before we get too greedy about the values of the endowments, let us take one particularly critical step and ask, how did our provincial governments acquire the land that they bestow as endowment? At the University of Toronto, there were treaties, and the colonial government set aside 1/7 for its own benefit and 1/7 for clergy use. And like the interior BC lands, they were very slow to provide much income. But before the clergy lands were wiped out, the university was endowed with a significant site near the city, where it still is, and much land in the north of Ontario. Treaty lands. And for much of the time of that university, the U of T, treaties that were not well maintained by the colonial and then federal governments. But UBC is on unceded land, land that is traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam. I believe that most students will learn at least that fact while here. It became provincial land to bestow by survey. Measuring and mapping the land created the claim to own it. To count and to know is a mode of ownership or even of violence. More recently, the university is engaged with the Musqueam and the history of how its endowment was in some ways not the province's to give. So where are the students? On unceded Musqueam territory. Of course, so too is most of Vancouver, as well as much of this region. There is a significant task of thinking and working with the Musqueam people to engage the history of this land, to rethink how their territory became a land endowment, and that yields a series of tasks for reconciliation, or perhaps reparations. My focused question, however, lies beyond that as I ask, what does this have to say to the university as such? That is, can we distribute our insights about living on Musqueam territories, insights gained from listening to Musqueam people and attending to the practices and cultures as they understand it? Can we distribute that beyond a topic for political change or even a topic for study? Is there a way to indigenize higher education? Can we recognize a change in our concept of the university as such? That last question enters a wider intellectual zone where these lectures will do their most significant work. For the focus of my work on universities revolves around one axiom. That is, while universities have been and are called to do many things, the ideas specific to the university revolve around higher education. There are other tasks that universities are assigned, entertainment in relation to sport, or housing and feeding young people in dormitories, or boosting local economies by hiring many staff, or developing real estate values, or accumulating capital value by investments, or developing new products for profits. Many of these very tasks are connected, even subordinated to the central task, higher education. Thus, my goal is to see how issues like dormitories and commuting times might make a contribution to higher education, to the specific kind of learning students can find in these major public urban universities. And thus the question which will return near the end of this lecture is, can the land acknowledgement and the relations with Musqueam people change our concept of higher education? The next section is called Study. But before moving to the space where the role of ideas will be most clear, I want to turn the commuting question around the other way. If we say that students live in the Vancouver region and that they are on the bus, why do they come to the university? What makes a place of learning valuable? Interestingly, the recognition that the students are predominantly commuters means that they do not stay at home. The strength of their connections with their home communities does not outweigh the benefit of commuting, of traveling back and forth to the university. They desire a place to study. I'm afraid that as the next part will be too obvious. Still, it typically goes unsaid. To be a student is to study. Students are not clients, not users, not captured by outcomes, indicators, throughput, nor are they consumers. They study. We need to think about what it means to study. What does study have to do with place? Or, and here the humanities professor shows off, what does the word student mean? What does the word study mean? I'm hardly the only person to think about study as such, and students are the subject matter for research in the field of higher education. There are few philosophical arguments about the future of the university, however, that analyze what study itself is. We are now setting some parameters for the space of these lectures and reflecting on the title of the whole series, The Future of University Study. With some irony, I will try to outline this idea by recourse to the history of the use of the words student and study, as documented by the Oxford English Dictionary. Emerging from this philological research of great scholars, I will draw some key features of study, in part to offer a best explanation of why students commute to the university. So let me link, because you can do this online if you want, or turn to the 1989 version of the OED, which is conveniently available to students and faculty online. Student, a person who is engaged in or addicted to study. 2A, a person who is undergoing a course of study and instruction at a university or other place of higher education or technical training, also in the construct of in a subject, often with defining word prefixed as art student, law student, medical student. We will attend to the etymology shortly. And for the record, the OED traces the historical uses of the English words back to 1398 for number 1 and 1450 for number 2. Let us notice first that number 2 focuses on a course of study and presumes that this is higher education, or what we might call post-secondary training. Students are the people who are at university in order to get something called higher education. Labeling primary and secondary pupils students is a late formation from the US. In an earlier time, my title actually would have contained a redundancy. Study was university study. Notice also that we then have 3 professional students as examples. Someone learning a profession is engaged at a university in higher education. And 2 are examples from the medieval higher faculties. So far, so good, as it indicates that the term links students to the professions not haphazardly. Of course, the more interesting definition is number 1, which speaks to the person and indeed an affect. Number 2 addressed in what institution and with what purpose. Number 1 speaks of the personal quality as being engaged in or addicted to study. Not a passive recipient or vehicle for knowledge, not a consumer of skill or know-how, but directly engaged. And of course that would mean, according to the dictionary again, anything from being entangled with to committing or being in bond to. But clearly the word of interest is addicted. A student has a study habit and she cannot shake it. She needs to study, wants to study, cannot stop, doesn't want to stop. A student is bound up with study and studies not from a calculation, but as an almost overpowering bond or commitment of him or herself. That may seem extreme. So let's move on to this key word study, again with some elisions. And I won't read through them right now. I'll read through them backwards, and you can read them while we go. As I move, I'll keep all 4 of the 6 that I project up there. We'll come back to the main one, of course, will be number 1 again. So let's begin at the bottom again. We see study as mental effort, thank you, Dr. Porter, First of all, to acquire a kind of learning, the way that even learning information requires some activity of the student. But we quickly move to activities that seem more along the lines of what will occupy us in the later lectures, reflective questioning and the search for new knowledge. Because with attentive reading and careful examination or observation, we're moving into something that looks a lot like what we do. Study is not just letting things flow in, and it is not had by surfing or rushing along. It takes effort and attention and care. Number 4 pushes to a wider horizon of outcomes. It still requires thought or meditation, but the aim or goal can be many other sorts of action. Study seems to be a way of acting thoughtfully and with concern. It's hard to argue we wouldn't be better off if we thought more and learned how to attend to what we propose. But the first two, now obsolete, last used in the 17th century, capture more than the learning itself, but the quality, as it were, of learning. Number 3 focuses on anxiety and perplexity. To be addicted to study is to be caught in perplexity, to be living in the questions, to be more keenly aware that the future is uncertain, hence anxiety. Obsolete or not, but very much part of the lives of students today. As for the first meaning, well, that takes us beyond the grasp of knowing into a world of desires and enthusiasm. Affection, friendliness, devotion to another's welfare, partisan sympathy, desire, inclination, pleasure, or interest felt in something. This is not a disinterested mind, but one alive with care and concern and pleasure with others' needs, which I would suggest others' questions. One last moment to capture the etymology, which links directly to these obsolete meanings, and which in a delightfully scholarly studied way is actually included in number 1, bracket, in certain senses of Latin studium, chiefly in relation in translations from Latin, points to a transfer from Latin into English along a trusty route. So you have the old French, and you have some modern French, and you have Provençal and Spanish and Portuguese and Italian, and finally the Latin. This Latin word seems to be about care and energy, affection, but also the even stronger zeal. In English, these meanings are understood as transferred from the Latin. And we see the word spread across vernacular languages in Europe. And we have a root for the university in this desire and zeal, this engagement in learning. As we saw, the later English meanings, however, become every bit as attentive and careful, but seem less passionate and eventually less inclined to another person, which might say more about what happened to the university in modernity than what it does per se about what study is and students are. We can frame an idea of study from the history of the words student and study, an image of a passion in this higher education often linked to professions and rigorous thought. If we claim that universities are primarily for the sake of students and explore what students learn in higher education, then we need to hold in mind the eagerness, the desire, yes, the addiction which brings them to the university. There are other paths to power, prestige, money, and even to information. To become a university student may be not a choice at all, says someone, just something obvious, but the experience of studying reaches its highest level when there is this desire, and even the addiction reflected in these dictionary entries. With this focus, moreover, we see a characteristic of my philosophical work, that it freely overlaps epistemology with ethics. The ways and goals of learning are intimately linked, and so an idea provides us insight into why as well as how. To focus on the student is to focus then on the highest possibility of the university as home to this sort of study. At the center of ideas for the university is an idea of study. I'd like to talk about ideas for a few minutes. I need to reveal just what I'm hoping to contribute to a range of discussions that are populated by discourses from scholars of higher education and also from humanities scholars who regularly lament the situation of universities today. What I hope to display in these 3 lectures is the value of ideas, and indeed of a dialogue of ideas. I'm not choosing ideas idly, nor colloquially. I'm not making an almost haphazard use of the idea in the way that Newman's iconic The Idea of a University did, where he never defines the word, rarely uses it, and seems to have no more than the general sense of idea as a view or notion. Just as philosophy roots its thinking in questions, in examining our lives, it also has a specific relation to ideas. Philosophers have disagreed about what ideas are and what ideas do in thinking. An idea here will be something that exceeds our experience and gives it direction. Like a goal, a vision, a norm, an idea guides the work of an institution with its organized series of practices. This interpretation of ideas does not view them as eternal. Any idea for a university is deeply historical. Indeed, we need ideas to renew the university, and so we need to set the familiar and traditional ideas into a dialogue with newer ideas, or ideas that offer new resources for thinking about the goals of higher education. Some of the ideas that I'll be discussing are traditional, and they are often the first principles that will come to mind in an attempt to interpret a university. So those will be the ones that are, in this context, usually white, I guess it looks like. Ideas of knowledge, of critique, of unity, of freedom, of isolation, of replication, have been in play often explicitly in conversations, vision statements, political arguments, and is the core of the self-understanding of many inside the university. Each has been subject to some stress, both historically and at this very moment. For instance, the idea of unity of the university has been disturbed so much that a counter term, multiversity, was coined and still has some currency. These ideas can be renewed, and they also need to be augmented. And part of what distinguishes my approach is a second set of ideas. These will be the ones in red. These other ideas come from a series of thinkers, most of whom were Jewish, and who had quite tensed relations to the universities of their time. The set of thinkers include Hermann Cohn, Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-François Lyotard, Gabriel Marcel, and Franz Rosenzweig. Each engaged extensively with other institutions of learning, some leaving the university, others coming very late, others creating a double life. We could analyze basic institutional anti-Semitic barriers to explain some of their career paths, but my interest is in their unusual ideas for higher education. A call to the future, present in the question of the students, generates this set of ideas. And these ideas engage with the more traditional ideas to help us envision the renewal of the university. Thus, I try to enact dialogues of ideas as different thinkers will bring renewing ideas into play. We'll step back for ideas for just a minute. Today, students still come to the university and they choose to study. Indeed, in our public system, students today work in order to come to university. They work in order to come to university. Means end. Very simple premise here. Some will say they're just looking for a better job, but somehow the university is providing a higher education. It is not just a bureaucratic exercise like a career placement service or career development service. You can sign up with other companies that can provide that. We need to sketch how the university as a place is suitable for study. So there are some study spaces. These places are for the most part familiar. The lecture hall, the seminar classroom, the laboratory or laboratory if you prefer, and the library. Insofar as the lecture hall is restricted to providing information, to teaching knowledge that is settled, then its role in higher education is diminished. Students do come to the lectures, but they can also stream them in real time or recorded. Unless the lecture hall is also a place for higher education, for learning to question, to reflect, to challenge the settled knowledge, and even to challenge the professor. The excitement of the question of studying actually trumps the acquisition of knowledge and also the pleasure of being a mere spectator. The seminar classroom, however, is well suited to listening to each other and learning how to listen and think in response. Whether the teacher is a graduate student or a professor, in this place where each can speak and all can listen, there's an intrinsic value in showing up. That place is one where new ideas are tried out, new questions are heard, one learns from another's questions, and one learns about oneself by speaking and by listening. A chat room online or a virtual room fails to host this back and forth and side-by-side interaction. Intellectual alliances and rifts generate much of the experience of learning, and the level of questioning pushes each person to reflect on their own position, both in this room and in the world. Not like a factory where things are made, the laboratory is the space of much education, especially teaching students how to do research, how to inquire. The mixture of tasks, reflection, conversation, review, group meetings, one-to-one conversations makes the laboratory a remarkable place to learn. Being in that place is not optional. The study that develops the ability to inquire into new knowledge, to frame questions, generate experiments, analyze data, write it all up, these depend on regular attendance in the labs. Students come to the university lab because they want to learn with others, and indeed to learn how to learn with others, to learn how to discover new knowledge. The addiction to study, to learning new things, can be amplified and trained in the laboratory. Last, most humanities students, and a good many others, go to the library to study. This has become a welcome surprise as many universities shrunk their book collections, discarding, storing some in repositories, limiting new acquisitions, and of course, digitizing. The issue is quite simple. Most students read online. This is a topic for the next lecture. And still, the students stream into the libraries. And many campuses have devoted significant funds to expanding and refurbishing their libraries. The renovations host studying. And the most important zones now are the study spaces. Students come to study alone, to study in silent respite, but also to study with others in small groups, or to study in an online environment, multitasking with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, news feeds, email, many windows open, all the while sitting at a desk or in a comfortable chair in the library. Somehow the specific attention and focus of studying seems more at home there than sitting at your own home or in a coffee shop. Here we have a place of intellectual freedom and sociality. It is unregulated, except the limits on food and drink, and reserved for other students. It is the very heart of university study, even more than the classrooms. And such, it also represents the dignity of study. The place itself dignifies the conversations and the work groups, the solitary readers. The library is for the time that is not commuting and not spent in classes. And that time, in some key ways, is the real time of study. Of course, students are there to write papers, do homework, prepare for classes, doing problem sets, also for talking with others about the work for the classes and about other people's assignments. That education-bound set of tasks bleeds through into all the other conversations in real and virtual space there. But, and this is the key, the library is a real place that draws students as the place to study, however born digital and online their personal sense of existence may be. A dialogue of ideas. We're now ready to frame two ideas that may help us engage the series of problems and issues that I sketched, ranging from the real estate crisis through commuting times to the land as indigenous territory to the university providing study space. What I hope to illustrate is that each idea offers us a way of viewing these different challenges about the students and where they are. Each idea has value and a quite different history, which I will spare you tonight. The core tension that is reflected in this dialogue is whether higher education produces a way of thinking and knowing that is independent of wider society and thrives on a social setting of isolation, or whether higher education occurs in a process of engagement and can flourish precisely where students are learning outside the university, requiring a permeability of the university to flows of inquiry and insight. The first idea is isolation, and it's closely linked to independence, even freedom. For an institution, the idea calls for a disconnection from the local environment and offers a chance to focus internally on dynamics that might imitate or else might dramatically differ from societies. Because universities always depend on the society that charters them, they often wish to keep out of the way of the powers. Political, economic, cultural, religious. Left alone, the university can pursue its work of study and creativity. Bound too closely to the powerful, the university is hamstrung. We will see that for students, this has a specific salience in interpreting the student experience, a significance that is often biographical, a certain period of time separated from family and other authorities. It is not hard to trace a recurrent thematic in UBC history of a desire to be not bound too tightly to Vancouver. The second idea, however, is more to our moment, the idea of permeability. The university could be understood as engaged with society through flows of knowledge, of questions, and in the eminent sense of flow, of students. Permeability is not simple dissolubility, but it is also not self-enclosure. We know that many systems are self-regulating without being self-enclosed. Indeed, that without the flow there would be nothing there. This works for living things most of all, but also for many kinds of systems, including information systems and economies. Identity is not rigid, but is responsive. Two flows occupy me most in these lectures: flows of people and flows of inquiry. I'm trying to offer an alternate to an emphasis on flows of power or flows of money or capital. A great deal of current debate centers on these two other kinds of analysis and the use of the university to concentrate, divert, irrigate, enhance, and in general control power and or capital. I keep my analysis on the human or personal dimension by focusing on the embodied flow of students. And perhaps most importantly, the flow of thinking accentuates the core and guiding task of the university: higher education. Questions of power and money appear in a different light from these perspectives. Much as for Marx, capital intensification needs to be analyzed in terms of a labor theory of value, where the value begins with the workers' bodies, time, and effort. When I choose to focus on the flows of people and the flows of inquiry, I'm looking to a richer embrace of the temporal and transitional nature of higher education. Moreover, or perhaps I should just say temporary. Very few people remain in the university for a great length of time, present company excluded. Indeed, the vast mass of people that are engaged with these universities are the students, and the undergraduates most attend for less than 6 years. Here I find myself at a precarious place in this lecture, where I addressed some of these questions in quite a different way 5 years ago at UBC and also at SFU. Part of what motivated those lectures was reflection on the founding of the Berlin University in the early 19th century. While there had been various kinds of universities, both urban, Paris, Bologna, rural, Oxford, Cambridge, for some time, the idea of a research university drew new attention and had promised not only for a new kind of urban university. In the third lecture, I will focus on the question of research and the university. So I hope you can come back. But part of what draws me to writings by philosophers in the debates about founding Berlin was their philosophical and moral views on student experience. In this context, I usually treat three models of student life in relation to the university campus. First, a university with a residential campus. The idea of isolation governs this practice and the discussion here. The students live in dorms, they live in the university. They've moved away from their parents and usually from their home communities. This creates a society of people who are almost all the same age and are all away from the authority of their parents. A time of freedom from supervision and surveillance in many respects. This model and its idea are prevalent in current elite universities in some systems, and this model dominates the discussion of what a university should be. And the university is responsible in this model to curate the activities for students outside of class. A second model, an urban university, is where the students live in the city, often in a student quarter. They live with other students, but not on the grounds of the university, and also not with their parents. This is a model that's more heterogeneous, social relations than the campus model. Ironically, even fewer people are looking out for these students. This model reflects many European universities still and has relations to both ideas, but is primarily a goal of isolation. Finally, there is the urban university where students live at home and commute. In a variant, they might move out of their permanent home and in their home community, but they stay in their home community, they remain local. These are students who can easily stay in touch with their high school friends and later are more likely to settle near their home. In this case, there's a physical permeability as the university is a site of inflow and outflow of students, literally daily. This is predominantly the Canadian system, and it is common in other countries too. Obviously, each model reflects economic theories as well as social class priorities. Each also is caught in a biography of adolescence, and in some ways performs a mode of moral formation. These two ideas give us different interpretations of the student experience in each model. Thus, we know well the story that people in their late teens need to become independent from parent control, to find their own way, to think for themselves, etc. Even as we know that college radicals often become highly invested and mortgaged in established social ways later. The idea of isolation governs many practices and concepts, holding that only by being isolated from their parents and home can a person become adult, can one's mind flourish. But imagine, if you will, a biography of our students, living at home with their parents, often immigrants or the children of immigrants, often the first generation to attend university, and bound to family expectations and cultural norms. What does that student experience in university, commuting for many hours a week and intensely engaged with a social and an economic existence in her home community? From the perspective of isolation, a person should be pulled out of this home and these practices. How do the familiar bonds and the surveillance shift? By going back and forth to university. In a different story of ethical and intellectual growth, attuned to permeability, much depends on learning how to respond to others' questions, how to think in response to others. The student living in the home community often has responsibilities in relation to family and friends that continue from high school. In addition, in our system, those students usually are working, and some are working a lot. At stake in this discussion also is what it means to be a full-time university student, because it rarely means that they are spending all their time in classes and studying. And living in the home community also comes with social events and networks that are ongoing, whether it is parties or sports, family obligations, music, religious practices. The connection with home communities can afford, depending on how you see it, claims or opportunities to spend time independently of the university context. Moreover, while the community may be more homogeneous than living in the city, it also is diverse in terms of age and education. In that case, a moral frame of obedience versus independence is impoverished. To be obedient is not the same as to be responsible. How do we learn how to be responsive, to attend to others? If our deepest insights into a good will comes from listening to others, if our highest principles can only be found in a complicated matrix of responsibilities, if even our new moral insights take their place in interaction with long lines of traditions, then the premise that defined our moral direction requires that we move out, sever the relations with family and home community. That premise might be inadequate. Of course, in this third model, many a student will feel limited and thwarted by seeing their family every day. But there is also an ethics that sees that this close contact at just this age can allow the university-age student to draw positive insight and ethical maturity from the responsibility directed toward others. Are we sure that maturity is only found by carousing with same-age students? If there is any positive role for the home community to play at this age, then isolation that is presumed as the goal would involve a great cost. The university is a parent's dream for the student, the chance to gain new status, higher income, but also in the dream, a chance to allow the mind of their children to flourish. Often during the time of the few undergraduate years, there is a negotiation and alteration as the student discovers a new sort of study, a new path, a new profession, calling that diverges from the socially presumed purpose, not without some struggle. But can we not ask whether it is always better to face the negotiation by moving out rather than by living with your parents? We're making progress. We get to change color again. Urban epistemology. How might higher education match this socially embedded student experience connected to one's home community? In relation to the idea of permeability, there are two places for the student's life: the home community and the university. I want to reflect on the capacity that living at home offers for higher education. And most importantly, I want to think about the commuting itself as a facet of higher education. I will call this an urban epistemology. What we see here is a spatialization of the tension between society and the university, as the student is literally commuting between the two places. What does the pull toward the home community represent in the student's life? These challenges of intense and specific expectations of higher education create a need for a student to explain the purpose and the learning she's engaging. For many of our students, there is intense communication with home. Even those who live away are often online almost daily. Can we recognize this call from home beyond the barest social norms is also a questioning, a source of those questions that higher education teaches us to attend to refine, to develop, to explore. When students are only acquiring information and sophisticated, advanced, settled knowledge that's over the heads of their parents, they might not be able to communicate it very easily. But higher education is something else. When higher education becomes the reflection and rethinking of that settled information, it should in principle be communicable, and not only to professors and fellow students. Our research seeking new knowledge and new perspectives is prompted most often by the world outside the university, by experiences that challenge society and its local realities, where what matters might not be happening locally, but registers to people who live there. In short, living in the home community can intensify the call to the student, the awareness of the need for communication in thinking and learning what is happening in the university. Such attention is key to a theory of knowledge that moves beyond appropriation to questioning and learning how to think in response to others. But there is a flip side, because the communication also comes from the university. There is a questioning that goes out to the city and seeks knowledge and insight and judgment from local society. Once we recognize that students are learning in two places or more, we can begin to imagine that the university not only attends to society's questions, but also brings its own questions in order to learn from the city. The communication can now go in both directions, if not symmetrically, then at least in an exchange. We can begin to imagine a process where the whole city in its diverse communities and social bodies is engaged with the university in its various faculties. Indeed, we know that for many of the professions, the university is already engaged and brings the practitioners into the university, sends the students out as interns, and so are already modeling this communication, not so much of information, but as ways of learning, reflection, thinking, research. Over the last years, there's been a proliferation of programs to engage with society. These stretch from outreach lectures to internships for students to gain experience, to co-ops, and again for the students to be in a focused learning environment. There are universities that are dedicated to these kinds of learning and the funding models that suit in Ontario, Guelph University, or Northeastern University in Massachusetts, or most medical schools which connect to an internship after graduating, and so on. But for our purposes, the harder and more complex models are community exchange research models. In several countries, Indigenous studies no longer studies Indigenous cultures and peoples as objects of studies, but always as partners in inquiry. The Indigenous Law Research Unit at UVic is one of a growing set where law students participate and learn how to do research in exchange contexts. At UBC, the Indigenous Strategic Plan calls for continuing development of collaborative community research partnerships, better defining collaborative research methods and providing training, and this does sound like I'm reading from a report, doesn't it? Training and support for researchers seeking to undertake them, and assisting communities in connecting to university research assets. And recent projects include the Heldsuk Tiny Homes Project and a series of 38 MyTax internships with coastal First Nations. Finally, similarly, the EPICS program at Purdue with its international network has been engaging society partners in engineering education for 20 years. As a field, geography is remarkably well suited to research and dialogue with societal partners, and this happens in many universities. And of course, in information technologies, there have been engagements with industry, and MIT, surprise, surprise, has led the way in this and other scientific fields for research exchange. While the focus on research is distinct from the now prominent high-profile emphasis on entrepreneurship, it is also possible to see that teaching students how to inquire in the double context of university and society may well extend to the placements and inquiry with industrial partners, as well as with the government. These various kinds of placements, partnerships, co-ops, internships, all show a surge in practices to let society and the university engage in advanced inquiry together. What I would like to suggest, I know I'm running a little bit long, but it's how it goes. What I would like to suggest is we have a medium of communication in the commuting students. They are spatially in motion, from home to the university, from university home. What if the epistemology, the theory of knowledge itself, were to embrace these circular paths or flows in order to reconceive learning and inquiry? Knowledge is not something merely built up in an edifice, but rather is in motion between people and between different spheres of society. What counts as a good question in your home community might be less valued in the university, and vice versa. Commuting students provide a model for communicating higher education, allowing exchange in both directions. Instead of disconnecting higher education's activities from society, the university and the city can embrace the commuting and engage the diverse communities of expertise, of traditional knowledge, of ongoing research. Such embrace would have to welcome the flowing in of questions and of learning from outside the university. And it would aim to teach students how to share not their knowledge as much as their new ways of thinking. The dialogue of ideas helps us to see how a wide range of placements and exchange could be coherent with the spatial experience of our students. That the university could benefit from taking up not only the knowledge and inquiry that resides beyond its campus, but could be making the flows of inquiry themselves spatial and a moving site for a new kind of learning. Before I conclude this lecture, however, I wish to flag the trajectory of the next two in a bit of shameless advertisement. The second lecture will address how the new information technology is changing higher education, and it will explore part of a comprehensive challenge to what we like to think of as knowledge, or as we often hear today, truth. The more basic structure of the university is not bound by unity, but by creative and constitutive discord, and that will help us orient us in thinking about how students can learn better to use their own native skills in new digital media. The third lecture will be the most philosophical of the three, as it addresses the fundamental question about the time of thinking, and I advance a radical call for the place of the future as leading the present in research. Here too the students, especially the undergraduate students and the professional students, will appear as the very future of research, and teaching all students the logic of inquiry will appear as the hallmark of our universities. But before I close, I want to return to the question of land and the question of where we are. While there are a wide range of partnerships and placements and modes of learning that reflect the permeability of our universities, A clear paradigm is in indigenous research. And perhaps most telling in that research is the recognition that students involved need to travel to participate in land-based knowledge and inquiry. It is not enough to invite elders into the seminar rooms or to the conference, nor to send out engaged scholars to report to indigenous peoples. I hope to learn more about the shape of collaborative research at UBC during my time here. But what I do know about that research at the U of T and at UVic is that it is not at the universities. It depends on a permeability of people to come and go. This permeability, moreover, can also happen in one place. For this university itself is a site of indigenous knowledge and inquiry, by which I mean the unceded territory of the Musqueam. Indeed, the important marking and renaming and re-signing of the new signs of the space. Beyond that, there is the vital task of reimagining the protocols of study, of research and criticism, to challenge and to transform the way we teach and we learn into a higher, landed form of higher education. Thank you.
Lecture and for laying out the ambitious program for the series as a whole. This is meant to launch a term-long, at least a term-long conversation and a term-long exploration for Bob while he's here. We're not going to wrap things up tonight. We're not going to have all of the conversations tonight. I'd like to do something a little unusual now, take advantage of the luxury we have of having a number of people in this room this evening who cannot